Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 19th of October. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, is this the start of a new world order? With wars breaking out in Ukraine and now in the Middle East, has the world become too reliant on the assumption that America will always intervene? Israeli journalist Jonathan Spyer and former U.S. Defense Secretary Richard Haass join me to discuss. Can the UK look forward to tax cuts in the next government? It's going to be tricky. The Institute for Fiscal Studies released its green budget this week, and the report makes for grim reading. Paul Johnson, chief of the IFS, joins me on the show. The global birth rate is falling. Why are women having fewer children? And to what extent is this really a problem? Joining me to discuss is the Spectator's Mary Wakefield and Stephen Shaw. And finally, is chivalry dead? And if so, who is to blame? Laura Dodsworth has written about this for Spectator Life this week. I'll chat to her on the show. Before we get going, if you like Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thousands are joining our channel every week, and you should be one of them. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support during challenging times. To find out more, visit candowealth.com for more information. First up, for the cover piece this week, Jonathan Spyer takes a look at the New World Order. As the violence continues in the Middle East and Ukraine, are we beginning to see America's world order crumble and Iran-led politics making gains? Jonathan joins me now alongside former U.S. Defense Secretary Richard Haass. Jonathan and Richard, thanks for joining me. Jonathan, you are currently based in Israel. Can you give us an update?
Yes, obviously the main event of the last 24 hours has been the visit of President Joe Biden. But in terms of the broad situation, there are still 300,000 Israeli reservists mobilized. They are in their great majority currently waiting on the border with Gaza. There is still Israeli air action over Gaza. And something which I think has not been sufficiently noted in global coverage is that the situation in the north on Israel's border with Lebanon is also extremely tense. There have been several launches today of anti-tank missiles by the Lebanese Hezbollah organization at positions of the Israel Defense Forces, one of them in a place called Shtula. There were a number of service people wounded. So the situation to the north is also extremely tense. So I think those are the main points I would raise just in terms of an immediate update.
Jonathan, thank you for that update. You write the cover piece for this week's magazine about the New World Order, suggesting that history is moving Iran's way. Can you talk us through it?
Well, my sense as someone who's been looking at the region, living in the region, covering the region now for quite a few years, is that the main beneficiary of a number of historic events underway in the Middle East over the last decade and a half to 2 decades has been the Islamic Republic of Iran, specifically the breakdown or fragmentation or even partial collapse of governance in a whole number of Arabic-speaking states of quite long historic standing. And specifically, I would point to Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and to some degree Yemen also, where central governance has to some degree broken down. And the Iranian practice, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guards calls, methodology and praxis of irregular warfare, namely the construction of or support for political/military organizations in neighboring countries, has proven to be a remarkably useful method for the implanting of political power and influence in those collapsed spaces. So the loss of the Palestinian Authority of control of the Gaza Strip in 2007 and its loss of it to the Hamas organization is a local variant of a process which is visible across the region and which has in its total brought to the Islamic Republic of Iran a previously unprecedented level, I would say, of influence and power across broad spaces in the region. And the current, I would say, events regarding Gaza are a product of that process in the sense that regardless of whether Iran sort of pulled the trigger or was in control tactically of the events of October 7th, which we don't know and probably will never know, the Hamas military capacity and ability comes from and only from the relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran based on the broader regional strategy, which I just tried to outline.
Richard, as a former defense secretary, what do you make of Jonathan's comments there? Do you think that history is headed Iran's way? And is America still the global policeman of the world?
Well, there's lots in there. I don't think America ever was, quote unquote, the global policeman of the world. Even at the height of its influence, there were many things going on in the world that the United States was not in a position to control. But clearly, we're living in a world of a more distributed power. And the United States has experienced, shall we say, quite a few setbacks in the Middle East, obviously, most apparently in Iraq. And also the United States now is somewhat more focused elsewhere on Europe and on what's now called the Indo-Pacific. In terms of the region itself, I think what Jonathan laid out is true in the sense that Iran has increased its influence significantly across the region, from Yemen through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon. At the same time, Iran can't be happy with the Abraham Accords, with the growth of acceptance of the reality of Israel in the region. Iran has also suffered all sorts of internal political and economic difficulties in recent years. And what was about to happen, interestingly enough, was a breakthrough between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and a certain United States and Iran entering into a kind of modus vivendi. That is all blown up by events of the last 10 days or so. So we'll now see how this plays out. But suddenly there's much more uncertainty, and unfortunately, much of it is negative. And it's easier to see how this war widens and how more problems come to the Middle East than somehow this is an unlikely way station to progress.
Richard, you wrote in Foreign Affairs that you think Washington should try to restrain military action in Gaza. What, practically speaking, would that look like?
I think it looks like what President Joe Biden is saying and doing in Israel. What he's doing is balancing support for Israel and its right to do certain things, but essentially saying, even though you have the right to do certain things, even though your emotions are telling you to do those things, you might want to think twice or three times before doing them. So the United States has clearly pushed back against the quote-unquote siege of Gaza, the cutting off of water and fuel, electricity, and so forth. So the United States has already pushed back against that, and clearly the United States is counseling restraint. And if I had to summarize the American policy, it's go after Hamas, but don't go after Gaza. Basically choose something that's much more discerning in what you do. So rather than going big, going small, whether it's from the air or from the ground. And my guess is that will be closer to what ultimately happens. That I think there's a lot of Israelis who also have fundamental doubts about the wisdom of going ahead with a large ground operation, all the costs, all the international outcry, the possibility it would lead to war widening. And then at the end of it, it's not clear again how you establish political authority in Gaza. Israel saw that in 2005, and it's not at all obvious to most observers that if they went in big now and then left, they would have a lot to show for it.
Jonathan, what do you make of Joe Biden and America's handling of the current crisis?
Yeah, I think what the administration is trying to do, and I agree with Richard on this, is to both support Israel, but also to try to restrain. I think that the dispatching of the two, or the aircraft carrier, USS Gerald Ford, and now Dwight D. Eisenhower is heading there as well, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, is deeply significant. And this is, I think, clearly an attempt to say to Iran and Hezbollah, as the president himself has said, well, don't get involved. Placing Iran and Hezbollah before quite a dilemma in a certain sense, because they've been talking in recent years now for what they call the unification of the arenas or unification of the fronts, which is supposed to represent this notion of a kind of united group of Islamist paramilitary movements behind Iran under Iran's leadership directed against Israel. And if Israel now does go into Gaza in a major way and Iran then does not intervene, they will look somewhat weakened in a Middle Eastern context, having not sort of backed up a great deal of rhetoric in recent years. At the same time, with the USS Gerald Ford there in the Mediterranean, Iran would be exercising, taking the real chance of tussling with, United States military response. So that will place them in a dilemma as well. I agree. I think the administration appears to be seeking to avoid a major operation on the ground. The government of Israel, we should be clear, has stated as its goal the removal of Hamas political authority in Gaza. It took a few days to say that. For a while, it was sort of not quite clear and different ministers saying different things. It has now said it at the top levels. If that is indeed the serious intention of the government of Israel, it's very difficult to see how that could be carried out other than by a major ground operation. I agree also that it's not at all clear, because Israel has not made it at all clear, what would replace Hamas governing authority in Gaza. That's something which the government of Israel has, I think, more or less on the record said, well, we don't know. We've not given that sufficient thought yet, which is not necessarily, which is not clarifying either. So that's a goal. If Israel wants that, it will have to carry out an operation on the ground. And I tend to agree that the Americans and others appear to be counselling against that. I guess we're going to find out in the days ahead what will take place. You can't keep 360,000 people permanently mobilized, right? That's how many reservists Israel has mobilized. You can't keep them in uniform, indefinitely. So something has to move and has to happen fairly close, in the fairly close future, I would say.
Richard, you said on Twitter that President Biden's speech from Israel was, quote, nothing less than masterful. Others have been more critical, especially about his use of the phrase other team. When he basically used the word team, others have suggested it wasn't the most thoughtful phrase. I'm curious as to what has won over your praise for that speech. What specifically do you think he's getting right?
Look, people can focus on little things like his use of the word team, but the overall thrust of the speech, I thought, tried to thread a needle. On one hand, he's trying to, I think, rightly and understandably support Israel in the wake of these savage attacks. And Israel has the right, and as he's often said, the duty to respond. Terrorism cannot be allowed to be conducted with impunity. That's it. On the other hand, he is trying to essentially counsel Israel. He's trying to temper its rage, and he wants them to go in a much more refined sort of way. Again, as I said before, to focus on Hamas, not Gaza. And that's a difficult balance. He's got a lot of popularity in Israel. He's banked a lot of goodwill from his earlier speech and from American aid and so forth. And I think so far, at least, he's pulling off this very difficult balancing trick. Its speech was both filled with personal reflections, also had a lot of substantive policy. He announced a humanitarian aid package for the people of Gaza. So it's interesting. The policy here is quite subtle. And whereas some of the rhetoric is more, shall we say, quote unquote, pro-Israel, but the actual substance of what he's doing, I think, is quite measured. And I don't think he would disagree with a lot of what Jonathan and I have been saying about the doubts about the wisdom of going in large, this idea of eradicating Hamas. I just don't think it's physically doable or politically doable with military instruments. And even if somehow you were able to capture a lot of their leadership, the next day something like it would fill the political vacuum. It's not like the Palestinian Authority or Arab governments are ready to step in. So I think what ultimately, if we can somehow contain this crisis, we're probably going to have to deal with a Hamas-controlled Gaza for some time to come. And then the question is, will Israel and others find a way to moderate Hamas's behavior, not because Hamas has changed, but through deterrence?
Jonathan, the Abraham Accords were mentioned briefly at the start of our conversation. Is anything left of the Arab and Israeli rapprochement?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to be aware that none of the countries which signed on to the Abraham Accords, and most significantly, of course, United Arab Emirates, have pulled out as a result of the events of the last 11 days, and I don't expect that will happen. Very much not so. So the general trend with regard to that historic process is still there. In a certain sense, the events of the last days don't in any way push against the dynamic of the Abraham Accords, because in many ways, the Abraham Accords were specifically a notion of bringing together countries jointly opposed to precisely the kind of politics and the kind of military behavior, if I can put it that way, represented since October 7th. That's to say, United Arab Emirates famously is most primarily worried deeply worried about the Muslim Brotherhood and about Sunni Islamism across the region, Hamas is a manifestation of precisely that style of politics. So October 7th and what's happened since doesn't in any way negate the logic of the Abraham Accords. In many ways, on the contrary, it precisely strengthens at least the security and defense element of the Abraham Accords, which was a very, very significant underlying factor. And in this sense, I agree that, of course, the rapprochement hoped for with Kingdom of Saudi Arabia will now not be happening along the same timeline. But the logic of the close connection between Israel and Saudi Arabia is reinforced, I would say, by the events of recent days. Can I just say also with regard to the issue of Hamas and removing its authority, you're absolutely right, of course, that as a political movement, it's not possible to destroy a political movement or a political trend using military power. Governing authorities, of course, can be destroyed using military power on the ground, and history is replete with examples of that. So in this sense, the doability of the goal Israel has set itself is there. You can do it if you're prepared to expend sufficient amount of energy and money and lives on the task. As to whether Israel will indeed undertake that now stated goal in the days ahead, sure, we don't know. But there is a coherence to the desire to destroy Hamas political authority if you want to pay the price for it. What is not yet coherent in the Israeli case is that the government has simply not related to what should and would come next, and that's surely a question that must be asked.
Richard, what do you make of that?
Well, again, the biggest problem is what would come next. And even if somehow you could root out Hamas, again, I'm not sure that's possible because it's as much of an idea and an ideology and a network and a movement, and the mere process of rooting them out in some ways would create more converts. But the larger point is true, and there's the problem after 2005. A political vacuum would be there. I don't see anyone from the outside ready and able to fill it. The Palestinian Authority can't even really govern the West Bank. How is it going to govern Gaza? The Arab world really wants no part of it. The quote-unquote international community lacks the capacity and the will and the consensus to do it. So again, I just don't see it as a serious short-term alternative. In the long run, I'd love to see Hamas marginalized, but I think that's going to require a whole different political track to the Palestinian issue and basically show the Palestinians who are willing to rule out force and live with Israel, compromise to reach some kind of a coexistence, that they will accomplish much more by going down that path than Hamas will by rejection and violence. But that's something that will take years or decades to work out, and that's something that could only begin once the dust settles here.
Richard, you've predicted before a new era of disorder due to the muting of U.S. dominance, but critics might say that it was the U.S. over-militarization that led to such conflicts in the first place. What would you make of that?
Look, the United States did overreach in certain cases, clearly in Iraq and to some extent in Afghanistan, but the idea that the United States is responsible in large part for disorder in the world is preposterous. That's just ideology. I'm not sure if it's coming from the far left, the far right, or both. I think historians will be critical of what the United States has done over the last 30 years when it came out from the Cold War with tremendous opportunities. And I don't think in some ways we've made good on those opportunities. But in many cases, it's for what we haven't done rather than for what we've done. And there's no way you can attribute Mr. Putin's violent war against Ukraine to what the United States has done, or now what Hamas has done, or the rise of Chinese power is simply a function of Chinese society and economic growth. The world deserves a lot of blame for what hasn't been done on global issues like climate change. So again, this criticism of the United States, I think, says a lot more about those doing the criticizing than it does about historical reality.
And Jonathan, just to finish, back to your cover piece on that new world order, how much of that world order can be attributed to the changes in attitude in places like America, but really across the West, when it comes to militarization and the appetite for these countries to get involved in other conflicts?
Yes, I think that is a very notable factor. That's to say, if we're thinking of the Middle East at least, the sense of a declining willingness of the West and of the United States in particular to respond to security threats. If we think, for example, of the attack on Saudi Arabian oil processing facilities by the Iranians through a proxy in September 2019, as one example of the sense that countries in the region have had of a declining willingness of America on that. But yeah, I think that processes can be attributed to that. I think, for example, the Abraham Accords in some ways was a coming together of countries traditionally aligned with the United States who jointly had become aware that the United States itself didn't want any more involvement inland and upstream in the Middle East, so to speak, and that therefore were required to make their own sort of links to one another. I do think that's right. I would say also, with regard to what's taking place in Gaza just now, that when we talk about various, this is not quite in terms of the question you asked, but just in terms of the earlier discussion, I think it's important for us to note when we talk about alternatives that October 7th was also a result of a failure of an existing policy. And that policy was the attempt to seek to coexist with continued Hamas rule in Gaza. So whilst undoubtedly, as we've been discussing, there are major difficulties associated with any project of replacing Hamas in Gaza, it is also the case, as we've seen so graphically demonstrated over the last 12 days, that coexisting with Hamas authority in Gaza may well be an impossibility, if at least we wish, as indeed we of course do wish, to provide security for the residents of Israel's south. So I think that's something which didn't quite come up in the discussion, which I wanted also just to put out there.
Jonathan and Richard, thanks so much for joining me. Next, the economy. The Institute for Fiscal Studies has described the UK as stuck in a horrible fiscal bind, trapped in a cycle of low growth and high debt interest payments. What can political parties offer before the next election? Is there any chance of tax cuts? Joining me to discuss the state of the economy is the head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson. Paul, thanks for joining me. The IFS's Green Budget, which assesses the economic climate ahead of the Chancellor's autumn statement, was published this week. It makes for very grim reading, summed up by the UK being in a horrible fiscal bind. Can you talk us through the headlines?
Yeah, I mean, the bind essentially is this, which is that we've got taxes at the moment and heading to their highest level ever. So you might think that means we've got lots of money to spend, but we don't. And part of the reason for that is that growth has been slow. Part of the reason for that is actually spending has risen a fair bit over this Parliament. Part of the reason is that we've stopped being able to save money on things like defence, which we've saved money on in the past. And part of the reason we're just spending so much on debt interest, around £100 billion a year at the moment, and it's going to steady off at something like 3% of national income, a lot higher than it's been for a long, long time, which means we're spending more on debt interest than we are on any public service other than the NHS. You put all of that together with the high debt levels we start with, and even with those high levels of tax, our overall level of debt is stuck. It's not going down. And of course, both the Chancellor and the Shadow Chancellor say they're committed to getting our debt down over a Parliament.
Paul, to pick up on that point about debt, I noticed that the IFS's Green Budget was quite critical of Chancellor Jeremy Hunt's current fiscal rule, which is supposed to see debt falling as a percentage of GDP by the fifth year of a forecast. But that is on a rolling basis. It is the definition of moving the goalpost because, you're always rolling over those years. So in theory, you could be making this pledge, but never actually having to see debt fall as a percentage of GDP. I noticed that the Green Budget dug into this a little bit, and I'd like your thoughts on this because those fiscal rules are set to keep government accountable, whether that be in terms of tax promises, tax cuts, or in terms of more giveaways. It's supposed to keep the Treasury on track. Do you think this fiscal rule is keeping things on track?
Why do we have fiscal rules? We have fiscal rules partly because there's always a temptation, if you're the party in power, to tax less or spend more, because that's always popular. That pushes up debt and borrowing over time. You want some way of gaining credibility, both with the outside world and the markets, and we saw how important that was a year ago, but also actually with your colleagues. I mean, the most important role in many ways of a fiscal rule is as a way of saying no to all of those secretaries of state who come asking for billions more for what they're doing. So I think you do need a way of really constraining what you're doing. The problem with the rule that we've got at the moment is that it's resulted in some bad policy. So the Chancellor announced a change to corporation tax in the March budget, which he said is only there for 3 years because he couldn't afford it within his rules for a couple more years. That just creates uncertainty. It also means that we have some sort of fictions, frankly, in the forecasts, because it's all based on forecast, not where we are at the moment. So the fiction that fuel duties, for example, will go up every year. We've had that fiction every year for the last 13 years, and it has proved to be fictional for every one of those 13 years. So you need to find a way of having a rule which is binding, which is sensible, which constrains government, which also has enough flexibility that you don't have this silly situation where you're playing around with them. Now, there is no perfect fiscal rule. What you actually want is the perfect chancellor who's just going to do the sensible thing. But absent that, a commitment, I think, to, in a more general sense, to get debt down over the medium term rather than that specific year, it would be more helpful.
Paul, sometimes I wonder if politicians, including in the Conservative Party, are still in the pandemic mindset where they just want to spend and spend money as if there are no consequences to that. Obviously, we're in a very different world now, especially since interest rates have gone up quite significantly to historically normal levels, but very significant from where we were. It strikes me that Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt do understand that fiscal credibility and fiscal hawkishness is somewhat necessary right now. But I also look at stated versus revealed preferences. And the government talks a lot about tax cuts and how much it wishes it could deliver it. But what it actually does is hike spending. And this government has increased spending a lot over the course of even just this year. And that's something I think the IFS Green Budget speaks to.
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on. You're right. I mean, if you look back at the March budget, the big thing in that budget was a $5 billion increase in spending on childcare. So almost a whole new leg of the welfare state. And if you look actually over the period of this parliament, it's an entirely different picture from what you got in the 2010s. So the 2010s were really tough on departmental spending. Period since 2019, we've actually seen, if anything, faster than average growth in public spending over that period. Now, partly that's obviously a reaction against the cuts that we saw during the 2010s. Looking forward, given the pressures on health and pensions and so on, I think we might expect spending to rise further. Actually, arguably the biggest fiscal announcement of my lifetime outside of crises was the NHS workforce plan published in, I think it was June this summer. Just that workforce plan, if it's carried through, will add 2% of national income to our spending and therefore our tax into the medium run. And I think actually sort of getting to grips with the scale of that and deciding actually whether we want to be in the medium run a higher tax, higher spending economy than we have historically been, or to be at the kind of level we have historically been at. But if we're going to do the latter, then we really do need to focus much harder or be much clearer about where actually you can make those cuts relative to where we are or relative to plans. And that, of course, is tough.
Well, no one wants to talk about that, Paul. And the IFS does work
Indeed
on this. The Office for Budget Responsibility does work on this, noting that from mid-2030s onwards, public spending is expected to go through the roof if you're not going to make changes and reform, particularly to the healthcare service and to the state pension. But those are two things that politicians in particular are not supposed to talk about.
No, it's really hard from that point of view. I mean, relative to most other European countries, and indeed actually relative to the US, we do spend less on state pensions, partly because our pension is quite low, and we expect people to build on that with their own private saving. The NHS is pretty average internationally in terms of how much we spend on it, and alongside all other countries, that amount is rising. Now, at one level, that's not surprising. I mean, there's no point in having money or being rich if you're not healthy or indeed not alive. So it's not surprising that people want to spend more over time on that. But it is a big choice. It does mean that if we carry on down this path, then not only will taxes stay at their highest level that they have literally ever been in this country, but they will probably go up even further, or they could well go up even further. And that is a choice. And the sorts of choices there, if you're looking at the NHS that you could have there. I'm not suggesting you should, but you could move to a world in which more people or more procedures are paid for privately. I slightly worry that we might even be drifting into that by accident. It's clear that these numbers are small, but at the moment, more people than a few years ago are just deciding to pay for their own healthcare because waiting lists are so high and so on. I think what we definitely need to do is not drift into something like that. If that's a choice that we're going to make, then it's a choice we should make.
Well, I think that's an important point, right, is that these conversations actually have to happen rather than it happening to us. I think if you look at government-only spend when it comes to OECD countries, the UK, even at the height of the austerity years, is in the top 5 countries because a decision is being made that this is going to be almost solely publicly funded and publicly run. As you say, it's very normal, especially as people are living for longer and want a higher quality of care, to demand more money is spent on healthcare. But what we're seeing, as you say, almost accidentally, or like it's happening to us, is this drift towards having, say, a healthcare service or a pension service with a government attached. And this is not something that affects simply this government. Whoever is elected next year, whoever is elected in 10 years' time, is going to probably be facing these same problems.
Yeah, these are problems that aren't going to go away, and they are. They really are common to the developed world, and they're getting in a sense at the moment they're more pressing than ever, because it really does look like post-COVID we've had a pretty serious drop in productivity within the health service. And again, it's harder to get that evidence in other countries, but there may be some of that going on elsewhere. So health spending has risen over this parliament, at sort of its long-run average rate. That means we have more doctors and we have more nurses and we have more money in the health service. But the health service isn't actually doing a great deal more. Now, during the 2010s, on the way that you measure these things, productivity did appear to rise, but we seem to have lost a lot of that. Now, that might be because of staff disengagement and disaffection. It might be because of the way things are being managed. It might be because there is still some COVID knocking around and the cost that puts on hospitals. But the reason that we've got such big waiting lists is not that many more people are joining them. It's actually that fewer people are coming off them. And that is a reflection of the fact that the NHS still seems to be struggling to keep up the same level of activity that it was pre-pandemic. So I think this issue, in a sense, has come to a head over the last few years in quite an unexpected way. I mean, it's more of a sort of immediate, sort of urgent issue, whereas it was for a long time it was something that we could see gradually coming towards us.
Paul, I want to talk to you about the tax burden, because in the Green Budget, the IFS notes that then Chancellor Rishi Sunak's decision to freeze tax thresholds is now set to pull 6.5 million more people into income tax by 2027, and I think 4.5 million more people into the higher tax rate. This amounts to, the IFS says, a colossal £52 billion a year tax increase. There are a myriad of issues with this. There are political issues for the Tory party, which is significantly raising the burden of tax. And I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you said people expect to get something for that money, but they don't feel like they're getting something for that money. Either they are on that 7.6 million waiting list for the NHS, or their public services simply aren't good enough, or their child was sent home from school because the building was falling apart at the start of the school year. It's one thing to raise taxes. It's quite another to raise taxes and to not feel the additional benefits of that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it is a very big tax rise. You can see why governments go for that kind of tax rise, because it's less visible than other things. There isn't any month to month by which your income goes down as a result of this, but it is meaning that people's take-home, that people's real earnings or real incomes, is one of the things that's going to be holding them down over the next few years, and indeed has held them down. But yes, it partly, I mean, it reflects all of the pressures that we've been talking about, but those pressures are not pressures to make things lots better. They're pressures really just to keep things running, or in some cases running less well than they were. And that, of course, is going to, that is not a nice mix. It's part of this horrible fiscal bind we started the conversation off with, where you've got more tax. Part of the reason you've got more tax is because we're spending so much more on debt interest. As I said, well, no one gets any benefit from us spending 100 billion a year on debt interest. And because of the fact we've run out of ways of sort of holding back the dam in terms of long-running pressures on the welfare state. We did that for decades by cutting defence spending. The state withdrew from a bunch of things in the 1980s. We had a decade of austerity in the 2010s. We've run out of ways to do that. And the pressure alongside the low growth and the high interest rates, has finally burst that dam in actually quite a sudden way.
It really has, and now they're being forced to reckon with some of those issues, as we said, they don't want to talk about. One area I wanted to press you on, Paul, in the Green Budget is Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has been insisting this year that now is not the time for tax cuts for many reasons, but one of the reasons that has been suggested is that tax cuts at this point might be inflationary, and the government's priority has been to bring inflation down, so now is not the time to see the rate rise. And the IFS somewhat backs this up by saying now is not the time for an economic sugar rush of tax cuts. Would modest tax cuts really be inflationary at this point? Not least when you consider that, up until very recently, real wages for the better part of 2 years fell under the rate of inflation, sometimes quite significantly so. Would a marginal tax cut really be inflationary, or would it just help people to pay the bills a bit more comfortably?
Well, I guess it's. You stated the sort of problem at the end there, really, that anything that is going to have a significant effect on people's capacity to pay the bills is probably not going to be that marginal. Now, obviously, if it's a £2 billion tax cut, that's not going to be inflation. That's not going to make very much difference at all. There comes a point, maybe it's at the £20 billion level, where that's sort of getting on for 1% of national income, where it probably would. Pumping that additional amount of money into the economy might be risky. And whether it's inflationary or not, you might worry that the Bank of England would respond, worrying that it's inflationary by increasing interest rates. So that's a fine judgment. I would not be in the least bit surprised if we find, probably not in the autumn statement, but in a spring budget, that the Chancellor finds some way of having some kind of headline tax cut, maybe matched by a less obvious tax increase elsewhere. But I think it's worth saying two things beyond that. Anything that the government might do to cut taxes, particularly if it is, as you say, a relatively modest one, will still leave this probably the biggest tax increase in Parliament in history. And none of it really helps with the other issue we've been talking about, which is that the public finances are in a difficult position. So if you do have a tax cut pre-election, and I think we've seen this before, the chances are that one way or another it will be undone post-election.
Paul, my last question. You bring out the Green Budget once a year. You're going to face a little bit of competition this year from Liz Truss's Growth Commission, which is set to bring out their growth budget next month, also ahead of the autumn statement. Are you ready for the competition?
I think we're trying to do different things. I mean, we're setting out, in a sense, setting out the facts, the options, and the constraints for the Chancellor. My presumption is that this Truss growth budget will be setting out some fairly strong statements about what needs to be done from her point of view. Now, we're all for growth, and indeed, I've written and broadcast quite a lot about the set of things that you need to do to achieve growth, and I hope that within that we see some things on infrastructure investment, competition, planning reform, and all those sorts of things. One thing that results from the conversation we've just had is if the centre of this is tax cuts, and we all want lower taxes, everything else equal, there has to be some equal and opposite, or roughly equal and opposite, plausible suggestions for spending cuts. Now, if there are equal and opposite plausible suggestions for spending cuts, it would be really quite interesting to see what they are and what the impact that would be. So we await that with some interest.
Certainly. Well, from memory, it was the spending side of the ledger that was missing from last year's mini budget. So we'll be all waiting to see if it's included in this year's growth budget. Paul, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV. The global birth rate is falling. In the UK, 900,000 adults last year celebrated their 50th birthday, while 700,000 births were recorded. This is considered to be a 23% deficit, or birth gap. In Italy and Spain, it's 55%. Japan and South Korea are set to have one new worker for every 3 future retirees. What's behind these falling rates? Joining me to discuss is the Spectator's Mary Wakefield and data scientist Stephen J. Shaw. Stephen and Mary, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. Stephen, for the magazine this week, you write about the fall in the global birth rate, and you talk about the practical and personal impacts of this. Western countries in particular are facing a huge problem in the future. People have become accustomed to certain levels of public services, certain levels of spending, especially as they get older in terms of their pensions and their health care. And practically speaking, the way things are going, you're going to have a fewer number of workers who can provide the cash for those people in their old age.
Well, that's certainly true. And I don't think we fully realize how much we rely on current workers to support our aging population. So, we think, for example, that most state pensions come from the money that we are paying into pension funds as we work. For most countries, that's not the case. Current people are paying the pensions of the current retirees. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the whole cost of the NHS in the UK is completely weighted towards the elderly population. So I don't think we've yet understood the financial impact that this is going to have.
That's such an important point, Stephen. People assume that they're paying into their own pots, that the money will be there down the line, but these are pay-as-you-go systems, essentially. And it might be the case that the money isn't there in the future. In your piece, you talk about some of the policies that governments have tried to implement to encourage people to have children, but you note that none of these have been terribly successful.
No. In fact, there's absolutely none that we can say, identify, that consistently we see will be guaranteed to work. In fact, we can almost say the exact opposite. We can say things that will be guaranteed not to work. What we do find is that there are some short-term increases, and those are usually people who are going to have children anyway, taking advantage of whatever benefit might be on offer. So the issue is really not directly about a bonus simply to have a child. People are having the children they want to have. It's about the basics. It's about having the core surroundings, the home, the environment, and the right time of life, I guess, as well. All those things are quite difficult for any single policy to address.
Mary, what do you make about this idea of the government's job in encouraging people to have children? Is that something government should be doing? Do you think it's something government ever can meaningfully do?
I mean, I was fascinated by Stephen's piece because his data seems to suggest that government can't incentivize people to have kids. So from my perspective, you see all these sort of pro-natalist movements starting up and conferences and everyone interested in the baby bust now. And yet we know from people like Stephen that it just doesn't work. So from my perspective, you need to look at it from another angle, which is why ask yourself first, ask people who wanted to have children but didn't, why that was the case. Why didn't they get to have kids?
And Mary, one of the people making those points is you. You wrote a beautiful and personal column a few weeks back for The Spectator about your own experience with motherhood and some thoughts that you've been reflecting on. Can you share those with us?
Yes. I've got one child who I adore and lavish way too much attention on. But looking back on it, I would have liked to have had more. So I was asking myself the question, why didn't I? Why did I leave it too late to have more, really? And it just occurred to me, I never thought that it would be too late. No one had warned me it would be too late. That wasn't what we were told in school. We were just told about how great sex was and the importance of contraception and this sort of thing. It wasn't in my mind that it would ever be too late. That came as a shock to me. And I wondered really if Stephen had found other women who didn't manage to have kids at all, who felt that this was a similar shock to them.
Stephen?
Many. And it's heartbreaking because many of the women, unlike you, Mary, ended up with no children at all. So I've seen a range of emotions, some hidden emotions, I think, because it's an incredibly personal thing, but other delayed emotions where I've met people after and clearly they had, one lady explained that she had closed her curtains after watching the documentary I created for an entire weekend, cried her eyes out, age 50, I believe, and then come to terms finally with the fact that she wasn't a mother and she'd never done that before. It was all being held within her. So there are a lot of people who I think, like you, are just completely unaware that the body clock, and it's not just the body clock, it's the ability to carry a baby to term and the ability to have a partner at that right moment. I mean, we tend to overlook that reality when we're younger.
That's the thing, that there's just things that go into having a kid. The partner, the fertility, and you're not thinking of all those variables having to come together.
No. Well, we don't prepare young people very well at all, and it's not just about the fertility. When we tell young people, I think rightly, to focus on education and then focus on career, but we don't kind of tell them that somewhere in amongst all of that, you have a few other things that you might want to be thinking about, like finding the right partner and planning as to when that right time might be. So, and it's a difficult balance, especially for women. It's for me, I very aware that, I'm a male in this conversation. It's certainly not the same, but hiding this from people or, simply ignoring it doesn't benefit anybody.
Stephen, when I was reading your piece, what really jumped out to me is that apart from big economic shocks, which can put people off having children because of the financial implications of that, which makes a lot of sense, there's no obvious government public policy that's going to encourage people to have more kids. You talk specifically about finding a partner. And I think that really jumped out to me because it seemed from your research that what you were finding was that you say some women maybe aren't aware, and Mary argues that she wasn't really thinking about the timeline there. But there are lots of women who will be aware of it. They'll be aware of it from a very young age, but are simply struggling to find that partner to have children with and to raise children with. It is a huge undertaking, not just financial, but emotional and personal. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, well, I empathize with, I think, younger people today, because I think in today's environment, it's, if anything, getting more challenging. I think a general point I would make is that it is a general point, but I feel that as people get into their 30s, it gets harder to find that perfect match. When you're younger, less people are already in a relationship, so potentially there are more options to choose from to find someone who you might want to go on that life journey with. But as you start to advance through life, you've probably chosen the town, the city, the place you want to live by your 30s. You've already got a friend group. You've already decided where you like to go on vacation, what your hobbies are. So you're narrowing down the specifics of what person would match with your lifestyle, rather than creating that life together. So the idea that it's fine, I'll find someone when I get to that moment in time, it's not that simple. That's my core point here, that there's always exceptions to this. There's always great stories about people having children later in life, meeting that partner, but those are more often than not the exceptions here.
I was just going to ask, it might be the same as what you're asking, Kate, but I was going to ask about dating apps. I was wondering I'd never used a date. I just managed to miss them, which is great. That's my... but I wondered if they incentivize men to look for younger women, because you've got this great catalogue in front of you. You can always say no. By the time you do want to settle down, perhaps you're pushed to pick someone who is sort of 25, 10 years younger than you. So women are being told to settle down later, establish your career. But by the time they get to the blokes of their generation are perhaps looking younger. Do you find does that sound right?
I've heard a lot of stories, and most of them are very challenging, about dating apps. One fact that we mostly don't know is that there are far more men on dating apps than women. So for men, it's 3-1. So for most men on there, you might get, one connection, hit or whatever we call it these days, every few months if you're lucky. Other men who are maybe the right height, looks, income are getting multiple options. And that doesn't benefit men or women, because those men are continually looking at the next swipe, with little reason to assume that today's date is the one. Women are getting frustrated, I think, that they're not finding men to settle down with. And there's a whole group of people who are not getting any dates at all. So there's a lot of things wrong with that system.
Stephen, in some ways, what you and Mary are discussing right now seems so simple. Prioritize finding a partner, go out there, find a decent person when you're on the younger side, and then you can set up your family. But I think, for a lot of people, they'll hear that and they'll say, well, I've been trying to do that, or, I did pursue that, and unfortunately things didn't work out for me. Or you'll have people in their 20s who are now getting divorced in their 30s and 40s, saying, I tried and that didn't work out for me. There is no state solution to this. There is an element of luck to all of this. So what is the actual prescription that you would give to people when it comes to addressing this partnership issue in particular?
Yeah, you're right. There is an element of luck in this for everyone, and we can't change that. But we can increase our chances significantly if we become more open to the idea, men and women, once we do find someone who could be a potential match for a partner to, have a family with, to be open to that instead of, I think, this idea, well, let's date for 3, 5, 7 years, and if everything kind of in our life fits into place, that let's say at that point, because frankly, often what happens is a divorce or the man finds a 25-year-old, etc. So it's just being aware and more open to it will, I think, inevitably increase the chances for many people.
Mary?
Well, Kate, the only thing that occurs to me is if you're looking to get married and have a family, perhaps think of those qualities in mind with a partner. So, we're all told to prioritize our life satisfaction and our pleasure and happiness. And you look for someone who's sort of super hot or successful. It sounds funny, but someone sort of kind and dependable, or someone you might want to be a father to your children, is perhaps someone to go for, at an earlier age, rather than in a sort of panic later on. And in fact, that is what really becomes attractive after you've been ditched by serial monogamists for a while. But yeah.
Mary, we've explored this in the magazine from different angles over the past few years. And I wonder if we put so much emphasis on women's understanding of their timeline and their options, understandably so, of course, to a degree, because it's their bodies and ultimately they're going to be the ones getting pregnant. But do you think we do enough education for men in this area to help them to understand what these timelines realistically look like, and also their own fertility struggles? I mean, it is also easier for men when they're younger to have children than when they get older. It's not the same by any means. But do you think sometimes we're disproportionate in our focus in this conversation? Surely it has to be a dialogue between the sexes.
I think in an ideal world it would be, and in an ideal world men would want to have children as much as women, but I don't think that's the way our biology works, and it never has been. In my mother's generation, a lot of women, got pregnant in order to enforce a marriage and a family because the guys weren't that into it. So I just think biologically speaking, practically speaking, the conversation is most productive when you have it with women, although perhaps you think it shouldn't be that way. I think it is.
Could I just add in on the men part? I mean, one thing dawned on me that I don't think too many men think through is that as they get older, if they're single, they're going to be competing with more and more men for younger and younger women. So it gets harder. So the fact that technically we can become fathers late in life, unless you are in quite an exceptional league of, Hollywood A-list or, multi-millionaire, billionaire, your chances are actually pretty small. And I've seen friends of mine actually into their 40s who had no problem dating in their 30s are suddenly finding they're not getting those dates anymore.
No.
Stephen, you write in the piece that you're actually somewhat optimistic when it comes to the deficit or the birth gap. Why is that?
And I didn't expect to be. During the documentary itself, really, it was, pessimism after pessimism when you saw the economic challenges, the social challenges, the loneliness. What turned it around to some extent is the reaction screening the final film to younger people. I screened it to 12, 14, 17-year-olds through college-age people. And the fire in the eyes of those young people who I think I would describe often feel anger, that term is being used, at realizing that us, the adults, haven't actually thought this through. We're telling them, do your homework, study, get that, education, training, get on the career path, all of this. And I think young people mostly are assuming that we've thought this through, that must mean that in their 30s, more likely than not, they're going to be able to have the family that they want to have. When they see people grieving the reality that didn't happen, my finding is only half of women turning 30 without a child ever become a mother, and that's global. So I think young people are going to make decisions, therefore. There's one beautiful statement I'll share with you from a 21-year-old young Japanese woman who just quietly said the documentary changed her life. And she didn't tell me what it meant what she meant by that, but I assume she meant she was going to prioritize finding someone ahead of the other pressures that society puts on, certainly young people, but certainly particularly women today.
And Mary, finally, on the same point, later in the program, I'm speaking to Laura Dodsworth, who talks about the death of chivalry, but she's a bit optimistic. She thinks that she's seeing changes in the younger generations. Are you seeing some of those changes? Are you as optimistic as Stephen?
I think so, yes. I mean, I'm excited by what Stephen says. I think certainly for my generation, if you had kids young, there was a sort of stigma about that, like you weren't clever or you didn't have a career option. We were all so pushed to, and that's what I think's, got to change, because obviously having a kid is fabulous. So maybe if that can change, if the stigma drops, then I'm hopeful.
Stephen and Mary, it's nice to end on an optimistic note. Thanks for joining me. And finally, would you give up your seat for a lady on the tube? This week, Laura Dodsworth writes for The Spectator about the death of chivalry. She joins me now. Laura, thanks for joining Spectator TV. You've written a brilliant piece for Spectator Life about why chivalry is dead. Do you think it can ever come back from the grave?
Yes, I think it can. Look, I'll be honest, I don't think it's completely dead. I think I may have said in the article it's actually incinerated. And sometimes it can feel like that, but it's not completely dead. Look, my teenage sons, I told them about what happened to me, and they were both astonished. They said they still offer their seats for ladies, for the elderly. So, some people are still doing it.
Let's dive into what happened to you. You had a horrible experience on the tube. It wasn't just that this gentleman, although I think that's a rich description of him, probably too generous. It's not just that he wouldn't give up his seat. He wouldn't move his bag.
I know, it was so funny. I actually thought he was joking. So it might seem a bit petty to hook a whole article onto one experience, but what it was for me was this nail in the coffin of chivalry. So picture the scene. It's hot. I mean, it's like a furnace. It's the underground. I'd be wearing heels all day, got a little bit of sciatica. I'm tired. And there were no spare seats. But this one gentleman had a suitcase and a bag on a seat next to him. So I got to him and I politely say, "Excuse me, would you mind moving your bag so I can sit down?" And he took a slug from his can of beer and he looked at me and he said, "No." I said, "What, really?" I thought it was a joke. And he said, "It's a priority seat for luggage." Which it was, but nothing makes you feel like more of an old bag than when a man won't move his bag for you. I just thought it was incredible because I wasn't asking for his seat. I was asking for his suitcase's seat. And actually next to him was a young lady, nothing to do with him. And she sprang out of her seat and she said, "Oh, would you like my seat?" But I've got to say, by this stage, I didn't actually want to sit next to him. You acquire a kind of an inbuilt radar over the years. If a man gives off a funny sort of vibe, if he seems aggressive, you don't want to put yourself next to him.
You're going to the other side of the carriage.
The other side of the carriage, not sitting next to him and his very tired suitcase. But this young woman and I ended up looking at each other, our eyes kind of widening with shock and talking about the fact that chivalry was dead. And, the week after, another incident happened which sort of cemented it for me. I was on an even more crowded carriage, so crowded that I couldn't go over and march over to help this woman. But she was wearing a mask, which, of course, no one's doing anymore. And she had not a hair on her head. And I thought, it looks to me like she's undergoing chemotherapy or some kind of medical treatment. Nobody offered her a seat. Nobody. And she looked quite shaky. And I was so upset to see somebody who's not just in heels and is a middle-aged woman, but someone who's unwell, obviously unwell, not being given a seat. And I think that's the thing about chivalry. Although we think of it as a courtesy that men extend to women, I think it's more than that. I think that there's a general courtesy and tolerance and kindness which has been killed off over the years.
Yes, I think this is an important point because we often think of chivalry in the context of a relationship, a romantic relationship, how people treat one another, but it certainly doesn't have to be in that context. Really, at its fundamental, chivalry is good manners, which it seems from your two experiences a lot of people are lacking.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think something has changed. I don't quite know when the rot set in, but I do think that women are partly to blame. I'm not going to say that feminism has completely killed off chivalry, but I think that's a part of it. You see, chivalry, I mean, it's an old medieval code, isn't it? It comes from a chivalric code where knights would honour women, help the poor, be brave, etc. And I think a lot of feminists have felt that's incompatible with feminism, which in a way it is, because if you treat the sexes differently, that's the literal definition of sexism or sexual discrimination. You're treating them differently. And of course, baked into the idea of chivalry is that men who are the dominant sex would protect the weaker sex. Of course, that's how it was then. Now a lot's changed. And I think that women have made a mistake in thinking that they need to respect these sorts of courtesies that men extend to them. Now, I used to do it. I used to do it all the time. I would say no if somebody offered me a seat. I think actually as a young woman, you get offered a seat more than when you're older. That's my experience anyway. But I would say no. I don't know if I actually sneered at men or said, educate yourself, but I bet I was giving off that vibe. Hands up. I didn't need a man to open a door for me. I didn't need him to carry a bag. I didn't want his seat. Now I'm 50. I kind of do. I appreciate it. I love the fact that my sons are tall enough to reach things off the high shelf, or they carry things without me asking, because there is a respect in which the sexes are different. We are physically different. And I think that acknowledging that and being courteous about it is a good thing. It shouldn't be seen as an insult. I think that particular brand of feminism that I used to exude when I was younger came from a lack of experience. And I think that feminism malfunctioned, as it were, when I had children, because there's no bigger reminder of your difference than when you're pregnant, you give birth and you breastfeed, and you are reliant basically, normally, on the man to be the provider and to look after you for a period of time. I think that was a big change for me. And I think the other thing that I've noticed is this general lack of courtesy, which is, like I say, about more than a difference between men and women. It's something that's crept into all aspects of public life. And it's really sad. I think we do need to resurrect chivalry.
Your article got me thinking about my own experiences and my conversations with my girlfriends in my 20s as opposed to my 30s. And I really resonate with what you're saying, that there was certainly a time where the attitude was, we're absolutely going to split the bill. He's absolutely not opening the door because I have to show my independence. I just think when you become a bit more nuanced about it all, it's kind of people just thoughtfully indicating to each other that they care or that they value somebody, or in the sense of strangers, just that they're doing a nice thing. You get home at the end of the day and you think, gosh, I was helpful. I was a decent person on the tube. I was a decent person on the bus. And I agree with you. I think that women should bear some of the responsibility. I do wonder, however, Laura, if men should bear a bit more of the responsibility. I think it's been very convenient, perhaps, for some men that the expectation has been taken off of them, and that they perhaps don't feel so inclined now that they don't feel like it's expected. Your sons, obviously, being the counterexample here.
And I think there are lots of them. I mean, I shared this article on LinkedIn. It was nice to share something that was, I thought, a bit lighter than my normal fare, but my goodness, this has got men really angry. I think a lot of people, they've done that thing of they've read the title and they haven't read the article. So there are lots of men complaining on my LinkedIn that chivalry is dead and it's women's fault. I'm like, yes, sir, read the article. And I think that there is a certain brand of man, like my tube oaf, who feels quite happy and entitled to sit on the seat. I think he's glad the expectation's gone. I don't think it ever suited him in the first place. He loves planting his backside on the moquette seat rather than a noble steed. He's very happy to have a beer can and not a sword in his hand. He looked pretty comfortable and he had no shame at all about telling me I couldn't have a seat. He had no idea what my need might be, or whether I was ill, nothing. Yeah, so there is a certain kind of person who is taking this and running with it. But then if I'm going to put some criticism onto men, it's that they need to toughen up a little bit. Now, I talked to one chap I know about this story and he said, well, yeah, I used to offer my seat and I don't anymore because women kept turning me down. And, if they've come across a few women who were like Laura when she was 18, 19, 20, they may be thinking, well, screw you. I offered you a seat and I'm not doing it again. You can stand. But the thing about courtesy and kindness is you shouldn't be knocked back so easily. Just keep going. That's the way to resurrect it. People can rediscover their own manners. Otherwise, what you get is we want a circle of love. We don't want to be passing on negativity the whole time. You talked about coming home and you feel I helped somebody. There's no greater feeling, is there? But you have to pay it forward. You have to keep spreading it around.
Yeah. Yeah. And not everybody's going to ask. Certainly, actually, most people aren't going to ask. And you have to be prepared to have your kindness rejected. But it's a risk that I think, ideally you want to take. Laura, I suppose my last question to you, if I may, is you say your sons are growing up to learn about chivalry. Do you think there's going to be a reverse here? Do you think perhaps women, realizing that they have a role to play in this, are now correcting and they're going to be raising their sons to be the next chivalrous generation? Perhaps there's something to look forward to.
I don't know. I think there's all kinds of corrections that are going on, actually. So thinking not just about my sons, but all the teenage boys I'm exposed to through them. While I'd say they've got their manners about them, I think a lot of young men are they're kind of swinging the other way. They're frightened of what happens between men and women. Will a woman pin a complaint upon them? Will she say that they looked at her the wrong way? I mean, you've got to remember on the tube, there have been posters up as well saying that staring is an unwanted intrusion. I mean, it's gone quite far. It's quite hard for young men now to know how they should behave because they're told that even looking at a woman is wrong. And, I heard one young man say, not my sons, but others, that he would be scared of making a move on a woman unless she's written down first that he can. So I think that there are all kinds of swings and corrections going on, and it's not all good. Otherwise you wouldn't see the rise of a phenomenon as well like Andrew Tate, who's pushing a really kind of hyper masculine braggadocio version of masculinity. I don't think there've been enough good male role models, to be honest, high profile masculine role models for young men, and that's the role of men to take up that role, actually.
I think that's a very good point because, especially when it comes to role models, celebrities, and the rest of it. I mean, I am still in shock and awe when I discover that a celebrity couple has been together for 25 years. That shouldn't be surprising, but this idea that to be strong, to be masculine, to be chivalrous is to show respect to women and to treat women well. And you're right, unfortunately, those role models do feel like they've been dwindling, and I guess we just really need to go back to basics here.
We do. Chivalry, the chivalric code.
Laura, thanks so much for joining Spectator TV. And that's it for this week. Once again, if you do enjoy Spectator TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. I would also like to thank our sponsors again, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support during challenging times. Visit candowealth.com for more information. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.